Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a few tense moments before now, uh, but I'm glad that I can join you in sunny, warm Lagos. We'll follow the program. I think we are just a few minutes late. Let me check if everybody is here. I know that Monsuru is around. Is Abosede with us? Then there's Vivian. I know that Vivian is here. Is Obase Sam here with us? Is Obase Sam here with us? You can't hear me. Oh my God. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but I cannot hear the LSA conference.
Yeah, I cannot hear the LSE conference. I don't know what is happening. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, somebody says I can hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me? This is Mansur speaking.
Yes, I can hear Monsoon.
Okay, good, bro.
Yes, but LSA sent me a message that they can't hear me. So I'm wondering.
Okay, do turn on the switch. And it's speaking now. Can you hear us?
I can hear you and I can see my friend Omolade.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. I will start in another 3 minutes if it's okay, because I I don't know if Abosede Babatunde is with us. Okay. David, I can see. I can see his photo. Vivian,
Thank you.
I can see. Monsuru, I can see. Obase Sam Okoye. Okay, this is another 2 minutes, I will start. If people have not joined by then, I would assume that they will join us later. So, okay. Yes, so we have 1 more minute.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I don't know about the rest of you, but I can hear some background sounds. I don't know if somebody needs to mute, because I'm hearing some sounds from the background. Okay, please, Okoye is in touch with me. I just need to respond to him. Well, okay, I've taken care of that. Hopefully, well, Abosede Babatunde has joined us, and Okoye has just sent me a message, and I have responded immediately. So I think we are good to go. So welcome, dear colleagues, wherever you are in the world. For some people, it's good morning, like me. For some people, it's good afternoon. And for some people, it's already good evening. And for some people, they are already in tomorrow. So I will just say welcome. My name is Cyril Obi. I work for the Social Science Research Council, and I welcome you all to this session where we will be discussing a very interesting book that traverses disciplines, borders, and perspectives. In a way, this book speaks to me because it deals with one of the objects of my interest, the Niger Delta, but it does so in a unique and innovative way. It's it it's a book of surprises, and it's a book of new perspectives and tells stories in ways that they have not been told before. And it's also quite conceptually thick. So you actually need to do a lot of unpacking. So it is not a book for the faint-hearted. It is a book for those who are steeped in various disciplines and have a sensitivity to the interconnectedness of the social sciences and the humanities. Uh, Looking through the book, which goes by the interesting titles of Enclaves of Exception, Special Economic Zones and Extractive Practices in Nigeria. Just looking at the title, you will wonder what it is about. Is it about economics? Is it about politics? Is it about the environment? But all doubts and any confusion is cleared once you start reading the introduction to this marvelous book. It's a book that is based on multi-sited ethnography, and the author takes us through from the very beginning that it started as a book on China-Africa relations. And there have been many of those. But this is a book on China-Africa relations like no other. It then wraps it in enclaves of exception, which are also enclaves of extraction, and then dives into the politics of resource accumulation and the way the locale is responding to the state and transnational actors who are extracting resources from enclaves. But at the same time, extraction is also multi-sited. It's not about extraction in the creeks and swamps of the Niger Delta. It is also about the extraction that takes place in special economic zones. So you are confronted with how power and sovereignty are reconfigured through a neoliberal capitalist fulcrum. In other words, the way local actors are responding to neoliberalism is not just about resistance, it's about adaptation, it is about mimicry, it is about how various histories and actually are implicated in trading practices and zeroes in on the role of artisanal refineries, something that the author reminds us of the various local names by which it is referred to. But this is not my review. It is a review of 5 distinguished colleagues who have been invited to share perspectives into this amazing book. And I have with us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, Professor Abosede Babatunde, Dr. David Cassiano, Vivian Lu. Vivian, I cannot pronounce the middle name, but you will forgive me. I want to say Chenju, but I don't know if that is correct. I would also welcome Monsuru Muritala and Obasesam Okoye. My style is to ask the authors to briefly introduce themselves, and then we can continue with the presentation. So if you don't mind, in the order you have been listed on the program, can you kindly introduce yourself? And that includes you, Professor Adunbi. So please, can Abosede introduce herself? You are muted. Or mute. You are still muted.
Just discovered that. Greeting everyone, chairman and colleagues. And the author, I greet you. My name is Abosede Omowumi Babatunde. I'm a reader at the Center for Peace and Strategic Studies, University of Ilorin, Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you. David, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Sorry, I don't know if the connection is okay because I'm in Lagos. Well, I'm Davide Casciano, and I'm an adjunct professor of social anthropology at the University of Bologna, and currently I'm a research fellow at the University College London. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next we have Vivian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian Liu. I am assistant professor of anthropology. I'll be starting at Rice University in about 1 week.
Thank you, Vivian. Monsuru. Monsuru was with us right from the beginning. Monsuru, are you still with us? I don't see him again. He seems to have dropped. Is Obasa Sam with us? I don't see him yet. So we will continue. And so here we are, dear colleagues, to literally break bread over this book. But I want to hear the author introduce himself. He thinks he has escaped, but he has not.
All right. Thank you, considering me, my big brother. My name is Omolade Adunbi, and thanks everyone for reading this book. Looking forward to your feedback. Maybe your feedback will help me begin to shape my current projects. My name is, like I said, Omolade Adunbi, and I'm the professor of anthropology, Afro-American African Studies, and of law at the University of Michigan, and I'm also the director of the African Studies Center there.
Thank you very much, Prof. You are welcome. You are welcome. I still don't see our other colleagues. Abosede, you are logged in on 2 devices. You may have to mute one of them or take off one of them because there is a kind of echo when you speak. Well, this is a very interesting book that deals with the history of trade at certain levels and the environmental practices that actually accompany trade, extraction, production, and accumulation. These are very heavy words, but it also does not just look about relations of power. It also looks at the multiple connections between people, nation states, interest groups, and the impact of these practices on the environment and how various actors actually relate to the environment, even at the point of extraction, and how you have contestations at various levels between the various extractors, whether it is the former represented by the regulation of the state and transnational oil corporations, or whether it is in terms of the operations of non-state actors, or what is described in the book as former militants and young people operating in, quote, illegal refineries, or fire, as it is popularly known locally in some parts of the Niger Delta. So at this point, as I mentioned in my message to all of you yesterday, I would invite each speaker to speak for 10 minutes. Now that we don't have 2 people with us, I can add 2 more minutes on that to make it 12 minutes. I must tell you that I'm a strict timekeeper, and at the point of 12 minutes. But I know that this is a very interesting book. But if we stick to the first 12 minutes, we will have more time to discuss. So you don't have to say everything at the first group. And we have members of the audience. We also want them to be part of this discussion. we cannot, because this book is so rich, you can't say everything about it, but I just want you to speak to the highlights and speak to and ask questions and interrogate some of the concepts that are being used. I also know that the author has asked for feedback, and I would urge all of you to take that very seriously, that this is an occasion. This is a kind of intellectual feast. We have one political scientist and two anthropologists. And in the language of democracy, the anthropologists are in the majority. But we will see what will happen as the discussions unfold. So it is my pleasure to invite Abosede Babatunde to start the dissection or discussion of the book. Abosede, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I thank the Lagos Studies Association for the opportunity to participate in this panel, and specifically on this work. And like you said, this book is very interesting, captivating, and I'm also fascinated by the multidisciplinary nature of the something, because the author was able to, take us through the historical analysis, the cultural dimension, and he also weave aspect of storytelling, giving us the live experience of some of the research subjects, and also given the fact that I've conducted field work in these communities, with the exception of John Creek, I share a lot of view about this issue. And I also want to say that the aspect of comparative analysis, looking at the case of this special free trade zone in Ogun, Lagos State, and the case of Niger Delta artisanal oil refineries, the author was able to look at the similarity in terms of how development projects of international organization, in this case, free trade zone by the Chinese corporation, and also oil extractive practice of Western oil multinational, how it impacts on the environment, everyday livelihood, the culture of the people, their environment, and their health. And then reading through this work, is able to consider the issue of the comparative analysis, looking at the similarity, because both entail development project by Western power, and how the author frame it as zone of exception, special economic zone, and at the same time looking at how this impacts on the power dynamics, the power relation between this global power, the state actors, and the vulnerable communities, vulnerable actors. But at the same time, it brings out a lot of issues. It brings out a lot of, it raises some questions, and it also raises posters for future research. And I want to look at the fact that when we compare these two cases, I am particularly interested in the responses of the actors, I mean the vulnerable people. In the case of special economic zone, there seems to be a kind of passive acceptance of, because the author raised issue about some peaceful protests, but which was not so peaceful, because he mentioned the case of a expatriate or something that was killed, and then the repressive reaction of the state security actor. But then when we look at the case of the Niger Delta, we see that looking at the trend in their response from non-violence to, he brought out the case of Kenino Sarowiwa, and then violent agitation. And now the case of artisanal refineries by that was established as by the ex-militant, which the author was able to frame in the using the concept of crude capture and crude recapture. But when we look at it, it raises questions about, is there a likelihood that the people in this free trade zone, will they also have there is possibility they may also respond? Because you look at the fact that the capacity of the youth in the Niger Delta to establish this artisanal refuge is because they are innovative. They are able to deploy, trace it to historical analysis or accounts of how they use local knowledge derived from Ogogoro, which he also called America and Sapele water. How this evil knowledge, local knowledge, was acquired by a sojourner in US using their moonshine or something. But at the same time, it's bring up issue about the power complexity of the power relation. Because when we look at the case of the Niger Delta people, yeah, they are powerful actors, the state, the oil multinational, and the community. But even when we are saying that they are innovative, we also have to consider the fact that they are able to establish and practice this artisanal refuge because there is a structure of power dynamics in which these state actors are able to even allow them the opportunity to use this local knowledge to be able to set up artisanal. So it's a structural power relation in a way in which the the state actors, the local youth in the community are able to work and to cooperate, in the sense that while they set up this artisanal, they are able to bribe this what they call the security agents, the army, who turn the other way. But along the line, if there is a breakdown in relationship, they destroy this. But I also want to look at the fact that, are we saying that oil multinational, they are passive actors? Because the author was able to trace the trend in the processing of this artisanal oil, how they refine it, from how they type it from the point, how they also take it along, where some are exported out of the country and the others are refined. In the process of tapping the oil, is it that he raised the fact that some of those who engage in this were able to get surveillance contact from oil and from the state. But at the same time, because some of the issues and some of the research on it shows that sometimes even oil workers are complicit in this action of tapping, extracting oil from, and then linking it also to issues of oil bunkering, where all this oil are taken along the waterway. So there is also a connection which I would like the author to clarify. And then I'm also fascinated by the case of Bodo, because it was able to bring out issue of the power community structure, how it redefined community structure in Bodoke, and why people are able to access free kerosene. But at the same time, when bringing out the issue of the negative impact on their environment, and in the long run, it brought out the case of Oloibiri. Can we say that it actually restructure power relation and community in a way whereby it benefits both the people engaged in this oil bunkering and the local community? Because when they even get this free kerosene, whereby issues of the far-reaching negative, because the cost outweigh the benefit. And by bringing out the case of Oloibi, I want also to consider issue of the long-term impact, because Oloibi now is left what it has become. He used the term something that use Africa and unused Africa. So Olobi is now unused Africa. It has been used. It's now unused. Then when we look at that context, when this community get to that stage of Oloibiri, what will be the longer term for the youth and youth involved, the communities? So it brings out, so I'm also interested in the case of the gender dynamics, because it was able to bring out gender division of role between in the free trade zone, where the bulk of the people involved in these activities are what men, And then the gender division of labor in the case of the artisanal oil refinery, whereby women serve more as retailer. And then he brought out the case of a woman who said no to them and so on, that women role. But I think we need to also probe further to know other role, because I think the role that women play there extend beyond retail and so, but I think it's also a basic for further research. And this is also an aspect I'm interested in. So I will look at 3 dimensions there in terms of the response, the varied response of the vulnerable people in the free trade zone, and the case of the people in the Niger Delta. And we also bring our issue of the impact of their culture, on the environment, on their, so I think also I'm interested in the case of the complexity of the power relation, power dynamics, shaping all these practices. The complexity, particularly in the case of the artisanal oil refinery, the complexity of the power relation between these actors, the state, the oil multinational, the communities, and also the gender dimension in this, and because it's more complex than beyond looking at the issue of gender, the issue of role and so on. So I think these are the key. But I like to appreciate it because he used a wealth of research data, and I'm fascinated, and I was able to read through all the work. I keep on, even with various challenges. So I want to appreciate the author for this very insightful and great book. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor. You have spent a few extra minutes, but I think that you have raised a lot of issues in terms of your reading of this book. You have confirmed some of my preliminary observations about its richness and about the way it challenges what you will consider to be the orthodoxy in other disciplines. I am not surprised that as a political scientist, you have raised issue about who the reconfiguration of power relations is benefiting. I think that some of these questions are already answered, but the author may want to take a look at this some more. The long-term impact of extraction I saw that there was reference to pollution, devastation, as environmental impacts, and who is living on the environment is local communities, the way they suffer in the Niger Delta, as well as the special economic zones. But the critical point is how power and sovereignty are being reconfigured. And I find it interesting when the author refers to neoliberal capitalism. But what we are seeing, if you look at the book and you do a close reading, is the interesting dimension of reconfiguring of local capitalisms. And so there's a capitalism represented by the state, by the transnational corporation, but there's a response in the local communities. In the early literature on the Niger Delta, a lot of it was framed in terms of a binary between the politics of local resistance and the forces of local collusion. But here comes a book that is actually unpacking and questioning that binary by looking at the whole question of mimicry, about how local capitalisms actually seek to mimic what you call international and state capitalisms, as well as the ways some of the contradictions at those levels are being reproduced, even within the context of local capitalisms, where the operators of local indigenous refineries are actually hurting the environment, but they don't even see that they are hurting the environment. But I will stop here. It is now my responsibility to ask and invite David to speak to this very interesting book. I know that Professor Babatunde has raised issues about the impact of extraction, the whole question of gender relations, and has asked for an extension of gender relations, and praised the wealth of research, which is not surprising coming from a seasoned anthropologist, and the stories that he has woven so expertly. So David, please, can you step
Thank you
up
very
and now?
much.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
I think I'll keep my camera closed because it's freezing to me sometimes. I'm on a connection from the phone. So thank you very much. And thanks to the LSA for organizing this session. So first of all, I enjoy reading this book by Omolade Adunbi, Enclaves of Exception, published in 2022 by Indiana University Press. I also had the pleasure of hosting, at least online, Adunbi at the University of Bologna as he was completing this work. So thank you, Adunbi, for that occasion. So the book in 8 thematic chapters, including the introductory and concluding parts, combine 2 of the author's research interests, one older on oil extraction from the Niger Delta, and one more recent on China's growing influence in Africa. Through developing this new interest and examining free trade and special economic zones, models pioneered by Chinese authors, Adunbi begins to make connection between what is occurring in these special economic areas and what he observes in the Niger Delta. So, according to Adunbi books, while there is a kind of de facto sovereignty in special economic zones that are particularly conducive to the development of new economic initiatives, young people and militants are also creating economic and employment opportunities in the Niger Delta regions by building artisanal refineries, even if in locations that are not licensed for this purpose by the government. So both of these projects are fundamentally profit-seeking, and it would appear in conflict with the state. So to create finished products for export to a neoliberal global economy, materials, physical and labor resources are extracted and captured with no shortage of negative consequences, such as what the authors calls the social death of the environment, as well as the general health of the local communities. A new and insightful perspective, I think, is presented in Adunbi's book that goes beyond simplistic assumption or pessimism or optimism regarding China-African relations. The book illustrates how Nigerian and Chinese authors have contributed to the country's integration into global markets and flows for quite some time, with economic, social, political, and ecological consequences. As well, in an equally fascinating manner, it demonstrates also how young people and former militants in the Niger Delta areas are also able to participate in the new flows of global capitalism on their own initiative, creatively reimagining knowledge that has been handed down from generation to generation. According to the author, these young people are also created zones of exceptions, which mimic the joint effort of the government and companies to create a zone of exception in which different but still state-granted regulation apply. My question here for Adunbi is, however, how much these former militant practices are really opposed to the state. I mean, if it is Nigeria immersed in neoliberal economic policies that needs these special economic zones, accelerator of capitalist economic development, are there not already plans to incorporate within the state this local knowledge about refineries? I mean, as an example, I have in mind South Africa, which is one of the countries where many actors from the state or not are interested in incorporating, for example, informal mining practices, if only to save money on the construction of new infrastructure. It is quite evident from the author's book that these special economic zones have been the result of collaboration between government and non-government actors from Nigeria and abroad to create something that benefits the present state. However, I would like to know how, as time goes on, this negotiation between different actors might also develop in the Niger Delta, even when it comes to artisanal refineries, at least if that is the case, as I can imagine. Possibly then one can also discuss the construction of a dynamic statehood that, while it appears to be a matter of conflicts and contestation in individual narratives, is also characterized by numerous negotiations in everyday practices, as well as presence in absence. And I believe that the author interested research methodology in this book, the standard case method, can enlighten this process. In my opinion, Adunbi books is well written, theoretically sound and critical, and is capable of making a significant contribution to anthropology and political sciences as well. It does so through a robust ethnography to fill many knowledge gaps in the current literature. The book speaks to me not just because I did the research in the Niger Delta before, but because I will be focusing on a futuristic city that has planned for development in the Lekki Special Economic Zone soon. And Adunbi's book is clearly one of the few to critically examine the history that led to the creation of these enclaves and to understand the developmental narratives employed by their inhabitants. The book is therefore highly recommended for anyone interested in Nigeria's current global social and neoliberal dynamics. So thank you, Cyril, and thanks to Omolade. And I'll try to be in Unilag in a couple of hours. If you are still there, I hope to find you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for a very, very, very interesting discussion of this book. I hope our audience is following this discussion. And as I said at the beginning, this is going to be a very interesting panel because we are dealing with a book that is innovative, that is provocative, and challenges orthodoxy as we know it, whether in terms of development, in terms of political science, and in terms of a lot of things that people have thought about, but it's thinking in new ways and unearthing things that people have never bothered to think about. And therefore, David has raised some very important questions. How much are militants opposed to the Nigerian state? And I can even add, how much are they opposed to the transnational oil corporations? His question raises a broader issue of boundaries and borders. Where does the state start and where does it begin? And is it possible to talk about militants only in opposition to the state, but also as being part of the state? There is a militant that was at the seat of power a few days ago, and it was hosted by the president. And this militant made some very interesting statements. Now you ask, was he speaking for the state or was he speaking for other militants? And you will notice that other militants, particularly the big ones, have kept quiet. And so this is a very important question about the reconfiguration of power. And I like the way the author has actually framed this because it is in constant motion. It's not a fixed entity. It's something that is constantly being renegotiated and it's growing. But the other question you have raised is the local Nigerian elite thinking of ways of incorporating the local knowledges on refining into maybe making its own refining of oil more profitable and in terms of costs. And you also echoed the whole question of neoliberal capitalism. And that is a loaded concept, which I don't think we will go into. But in terms of the theoretical sophistication, I think he has spoken into. I hope our other discussants would also go deeper into it. And the point I had made earlier about mimicry, about how capitalism is becoming localized, if not in a way that we read about it in textbooks, but how it is becoming part of the politics and the whole notion of sovereignty. Who is the sovereign? Who owns the land? Is it the states by law, or is it the people who live on the land? And what happens if the people who live off the land are contributing to the social death of the land? These are wider questions that we should reflect on. And on that note, it is my pleasure to invite Vivian, who has been waiting patiently, to please discuss this important book. Thank you. Vivian, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a perfect segue to my comments. And honestly, I'll be building on whatever has been said before. And I also want to apologize for not being in person. This week is a week where I'm moving jobs and homes, so I wasn't able to make it in person. And I apologize for that, mostly to myself. I'm very sad I'm missing out on this in person. But I just wanted to join everyone in congratulating Professor Adunbi on this book. It is a very ambitious and really creative book. I know when I went into it, I started, because I had heard some paper versions focusing on Lekki or focusing on one other thing. And so when I went into it, I had a very narrow idea of what it would be about. But each chapter kind of unveiled something, kind of new creative connections I hadn't thought about before. So Just in my quick comments today, I wanted to think about how the book re-theorizes special economic zones, which is a concept that has featured heavily in recent decades, particularly related to Chinese development strategies. And these kinds of special economic zones, SEZs, were domestically pursued in China to very dramatic effect since the 1980s in the industrial boom there. And so these SEZs, as you might know, are very globally famous for producing some of the most emblematic sites of mass commodity production in modern times. So in China, this is from the 1980s, the early ones, including one of established in Shenzhen, which was a very small city at the time, completely transformed the city and region into a huge global manufacturing and export hub. And so today we know Shenzhen because it is crucial in global commodity chains for producing electronics like iPhones, for example. And in China, they were seen as select spaces for foreign capital, a way to enfold huge capitalist enterprise into the Chinese economy, kind of establishing and cementing China's position in global commodity chains as a resource transformer and labor source. And they also tried to, of course, control and limit capitalism spatially to particular sites. But what we see is that while factories are spatially limited to the zones themselves, the social effects, or what, let's say, economists will conveniently leave out of their models as externalities, those are very vast. And so we know in China, at least, it's transformed domestic labor markets. It's created new ecosystems of business regionally, and also enabled resource extraction, industrial production, and environmental pollution to just huge effects in China domestically. So one of the things I found really important about this book is it's trying to re-examine these recent iterations of SEZs as they have become exported as economic models through Chinese partnerships across the world now. So in Nigeria, of course, you all might know the ones in Lekki and Ogun State. And so the book importantly reorients this concept of SEZs in Nigerian history. So it's not just something that's imported from China, but lies in a much longer history and complex context of various kinds of economic enclaving in Nigeria. So most immediately, it explores how the SEZs are not necessarily unique in their attempts to shield some kinds of economic activity from the Nigerian state. And so the linkages that some other panelists have talked about already with artisanal oil refining sites in the Niger Delta, as well as agoro brewing, alcohol brewing. And so in the book, Adunbi draws on theorists, a wide range of theorists, including Agamben and Murray, to think about enclaves of exception as the quote, processes that produce a systematic assemblage of enclosed spaces for the purposes of generating economic activity, both regulated and unregulated by the state. These new assemblages complicate the meaning and intent of SEZs to encompass artisanal refineries and free trade zones. So each of the chapter kind of tries to think about these enclaves differently, and also draw on different kinds of historical timelines. So this is one thing I really thought was interesting about the book, is that different chapters drew on different parts of Nigerian history. So we see that colonial history is important. I thought the very detailed historical revisiting of Lekki as not just a place of the current port development, but actually as a historical place for centuries of regional trade, global trade, and migration. So we see transformations from slave trade to palm oil trade and other kind of colonial export-oriented economic transitions. There's also kind of post-colonial histories that are revisited. So thinking about the establishment of free trade zones like in Calabar by various Nigerian regimes in the 80s and 90s, trying to think about how to capitalize on exports as a meaningful generator of economic developments. There's an interesting and unexpected detour, or unexpected for me at least, where one chapter takes us to local alcohol production in the Niger Deltas, linking it to the 1930s moonshine production in the United States. And so these unexpected linkages show us how intertwined histories are of technology and social life, of alcohol production and consumption, and resource extraction and labor. And so again, one of the major, I think, contributions of the book is thinking about how these economic enclaves can help us re-theorize special economic zones and their effects. Whatever the scale and kind, these economic enclaves try to produce new techniques of extraction, surveillance, as we see, and knowledge production. And this has been discussed somewhat by the other panelists, but we see that the artisanal oil refining techniques practiced by Niger Delta youths are, on one hand, politically and materially subversive, resourceful, innovative. They draw from vast technical experience and local knowledge. But the book also doesn't over-romanticize this, and also shows us that these artisanal sites are also forced to reproduce techniques of extraction, and are also environmentally and socially consequential. So one of the points I thought was interesting, it briefly mentions how multinational oil companies themselves also perform strategic kinds of enclaving, whether through housing enclaves for expatriates or offshoring. So I thought this is an interesting point that could be for other scholars to use theoretically in their own discussions about other kinds of economic enclaves in Nigeria, whether that's, let's say, segregation or elite residential areas, or consulates and corporate sites, other kinds of sites that the Nigerian government has little or no jurisdiction over. And another interesting point is the book notes how they fall in these economic zones also fall in a longer history of racialization of economic enclaving. So people talked about the special economic zone in Lekki, for example, as not being in Nigeria, quote unquote. Of course, it is physically in Nigeria. But Adunbi shows us how people talk about it as not being in Nigeria. That's linked to what people think of as who is also a Nigerian or not, which is also racialized in different ways. There's a hierarchy of respect, prestige, and what, in simple terms, people maybe can get away with, right? According to race and ideas of being an expatriate. And this is linked in the book to histories of colonialism as well, and into the post-colonial period. So the last point I wanted to make is just thinking about how, so I'm a fellow cultural anthropologist, guilty as charged by Dr. Obi. And I also wanted to point out what I thought another major contribution of the book is it's not just simply re-theorizing special economic zones in Nigeria, but I thought the heart of the book and the through line throughout was this commitment towards ethnographically focusing on communities that are located spatially at the sites of economic enclaves. So how are the inhabitants at the time of the development of these enclaves affected by them socially, economically, politically, spiritually? And this in some ways is a story about the tensions between ideas of national development or community at a huge or abstract scale, and then local development or community at an immediate and intimate scale. So who is seen as disposable or inconvenient or in the way of huge economic projects. And so the book makes an interesting point to show that recent Chinese SCZs were pursued by Nigerian state governments or local governments, city governments, not the federal government necessarily. So there's kind of different ways that political entities themselves are engaged with these special economic zones. It's not just Nigeria's a nation state, federal nation state writ large, but also regional governments. And most clearly, the book shows how Lekki communities are affected by these new massive projects. So the port and free trade zone, of course, what's going to sprout up around that with the airport, businesses, probably new residential neighborhoods that will follow. And this is where the idea of social death really comes up, right? In the social death of the environment and for the communities who immediately inhabit the areas. And so one striking image, I guess I'll just leave everyone with as I come to my 10 minutes, is that I thought really stood out in the book was Professor Adunbi points out, the symbolic imagery of Lekki, these palm trees swaying in the Atlantic breeze, are in reality being cleared for these projects, and that there's communities locally fighting for even specific trees to be saved because they're spiritual anchors for local residents. They are where burial grounds, people's ancestors have been buried, where people continue to be engaged with that place and the history of that place in particular. And so we have this kind of symbolic idea of these calm palm trees while they're also being cleared and being fought for by these local communities. So I think I will wrap up there, but I also just lastly wanted to point out that by pointing out the social death around economic enclaves, the book shows that they are essentially conceptually at tension and in contradiction with itself. So they're often theorized and described as exceptional spaces, maybe distant from the state, outside of state purview, the public. It's where free market space should theoretically benefit an abstract whole, but actually they most immediately rely on everything public, or at least things that are co-shared, inhabited. So they use public infrastructure like roads, right? Without necessarily directly contributing to them. They draw on land belonging to people in the surrounding communities and also the future of the environment and people in that region. So that kind of contradiction between these enclaves is being talked about, advocated for in policy as being separate and an important separate from the wider public, when in fact they actually rely on everything public. And I look forward to it. And congratulations on the book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Vivian, for opening up another very interesting dimension to this book. There are a lot of questions that are embedded in your submission, but I was quite intrigued by your putting sophistication and exaggeration in one sentence about the innovativeness of youth. And as a political scientist, we begin to, I earlier raised up the question of where does the state start and where does the state end? And is a kind of sovereignty that we're talking about with the ex-militias or ex-militants. Are they also becoming local sovereigns within their communities? What are they becoming, and what does it mean for the kind of mimicry that we are seeing? We see mimicry in terms of the adaptation and perhaps expropriation of moonshine technology into distillation of crude oil into various fuels. But we also see an element of this in terms of what the state is doing by importing a developmental model that has been tried and tested in China into Africa. It's also possible to question whether this is neoliberalism in the classic sense of the word, and if it's about regulation. Classical neoliberalism is about deregulation. But what we are seeing is a regulation of spaces. So is this really neoliberal economic development? And how can development in this regard, which is leading to social death, be development? And it raises the question of development for who and by who. But I see that Obasesam has been waiting patiently, and I will not go further. So it is my pleasure to invite Obasesam to please make his presentation. We are still waiting for Monsuru. We have not seen him yet. But Obasesam, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Obi. And thank you, Professor Adunbi, for writing such a powerful and intellectually engaging book. I read your book and I kept reading it over and over again because the subject itself is intriguing. So I think the book is analytically insightful, conceptually illuminating, and grounded in what I see as an anthropological methodology that is empirically rigorous as it derives from real-world data and observations rather than relying on solely theoretical or speculative reasoning. So I think the book makes a unique contribution to the literature. But I tend to look at this book from three lenses. Besides appraising its methodological strengths, which is rooted in strong anthropological findings and inquiry. And again, I'm not surprised because Professor Adunbi is a trained anthropology, as I noticed. So it shows up in all chapters of the book, that anthropological temperament, is there, it shows up. And it makes the book more inviting as you continue to read through the stories. It invites a conversation into the mind of the writer. And then I tend to also look at the book from both theoretical and conceptual, strengths. Theoretically, I think the author is trying to argue that artisanal refining is transforming the relationship between the youth in the Niger Delta, the oil extraction itself, and the state, and even corporations. And then this is creating disenfranchisement. And then disenfranchised citizens who are displaced from their livelihoods and dispossessed of resources they consider as theirs now mimic the state and corporations by creating extractive economic zones, special economic zones. But the question is local capitalism, as Professor Obi has been saying, a mimicry of neoliberal capitalism itself, or an attempt to transform unequal power relations that create, reinforce, and even sustain the alienation of the youth from the benefits of the oil revenue. This mimicry is survivalist strategy. Is it an attempt to transform neoliberal capitalism or the emerging development model, which Professor Obi has been talking about? Or is it an attempt to seek alternative forms of survival by engaging in artisanal refining? However, I feel that Professor Adunbi has made another interesting conversation by utilizing the concept of enclaves of exception to analyze these complex relationships. The books makes a creative attempt to reintroduce the Marxian analysis of alienation into the broader political economy debates on the Niger Delta. And this to me serves as a catalyst for a new intellectual discourse on Nigeria's petro-insurgency and makes a substantial contribution to the arguments put forth by scholars like our own respected Professor B, people like Paul Collier, Anke Hoffler, Michael Rose, again, Cyril Obi, Wafi Okumi-Demodia, Kenneth Umeji, and other prominent researchers. So by examining these transformations and their implications for natural resources and the environment, the book, I believe, invites a fresh intellectual conversation on the need to rethink the nature of power in the Niger Delta, the nature of extractivism in the Niger Delta, and how all of these are implicated in the political economy of oil, the political economy of oil extraction, the political economy of development and underdevelopment that is producing and reproducing this, what the author refers to as the social death of the environment. So the question is, are the former insurgents engaging in a new model of political economy? Are they trying to transform the already dominant power structures that have been sustained over time? And is artisanal mining an unintended consequence or a direct consequence of their attempt to transform the petro state? Another conceptual strength to me is what he calls crude capture, and the book makes a unique contribution to the literature by using the concept of crude capture to illustrate how artisanal refineries replicate state and corporate extraction methods, thereby complicating the meaning of and practice of special economic zones. In this case, I believe it directs theoretical attention towards the constellation of actors involved in crude capture and the overlapping notions of power. So it is not just the state and corporations conspiring to capture crude oil. It is the rise of, new constellations of power from below, because Michel Foucault sees power as ephemeral. So power is not just coming from the top, power also flows from below. And if you're looking at it even from a Gramscian political economy perspective, you see these counter-hegemonic forces. So artisanal refinery could be seen as a counter-hegemonic force trying to transform the dominant power relation. So I think the book also helps to expand the contours of analysis by reintroducing Marxian political economy, combining Marxian political economy with anthropology and development studies to create a new way of looking at or to conceptualize the dynamics of power in the Niger Delta. And something I find very interesting is the idea of infrastructure. Moving away from infrastructure as a mechanism of development, to infrastructure, to helping us to see infrastructure as a technology, as an emerging technology that is applied by both the powerful, which is the state, in its development model, and how infrastructure is regaining new meaning, how the alienation, how local actors, are mobilizing, the infrastructure as a technology to transform their own marginalization. And this is very important because ordinarily, when the state talks about infrastructure, it is something like it's a monolithic concept. We're trying to develop, they're trying to implement infrastructural development, but then we see infrastructure in a completely new light, not necessarily as a mechanism of economic and political domination within communities, but as a technology that is now emerging, where the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised mobilizes infrastructure to transform their marginalization. And the change in nature of sovereignty, I like how Professor Adunbi crafted or conceptualized this idea of sovereignty to understand the redefinition of sovereignty in special economic zones, and signifying what I see as a reconceptualization of even sovereignty itself, as we see in the state trying to exercise sovereignty over a particular space. But in this case, he's connecting sovereignty to historical dynamics of colonial strategies for extractive or resource extraction. And they're revealing how the establishment of special economic zones produces colonial wealth transfer strategies from one enclave to another, and how these dynamics are reproducing themselves in Nigeria, in special economic zones in Nigeria. I find that to be very, very important because it helps us to understand the spatial-temporal context of these hybrid extraction technologies and how they are embedded in both local and transnational knowledge networks, as he says. But what I think is missing in this analysis is that beyond the innovation of these brewing technologies, beyond the use of these innovations in transforming artisanal mining activities, the book does not make an attempt to discuss the broader implication of the peace process, the Niger Delta peace process, in the dynamics of artisanal refining, in the sense that most of the actors or former insurgents were trained outside against sophistication in the use of technologies of refining, which are now used to transform their alienation upon return to Nigeria and finding that they do not fit in the oil industry, or they still feel alienated from the oil industry they felt would benefit them. And as a result, we see how the peace process is leading to transformations in the oil industry by training many youth who were previously marginalized, giving them education, sophisticated education overseas. But when they return to Nigeria, they face discrimination in the oil industry, as companies are unwilling to hire them. And as a result, they become vulnerable. And that vulnerability now leads them to mobilize their ingenuity, their training, you know, to participate in artisanal refining. So I think the book missed that part of this complexity of the dynamic of artisanal refining, the fact that the peace process itself might have some implication which has not been carefully captured in the book. In other words, there are connections between the peace process and new extraction technologies that, instead of mimicking the state and the extraction industries, seek to transform the dynamics of exclusion. So my argument is that, and which comes up also as a question, is that is artisanal refining again an attempt to mimic the state structure or an attempt to create alternative forms of survival by groups who feel alienated from the mainstream of what Professor Obi has been describing as the neoliberal model of development. You know, so those who feel, those on the fringes of society who feel alienated now create this alternative means of survival. So is it an attempt to mimic the state or an attempt to transform the state itself by creating alternative enclaves? So thank you very much. Again, this is a wonderful book, and I'm looking forward to reviewing it and probably publishing my review.
Well, thank you very much, Obase-san, for a very powerful Marxian political economic dissection of you have raised a lot of issues about power. There is this book of the pedagogy of the oppressed. There's this war of the dispossessed and the alienated by adopting the very same tools that have been used against them, against their oppressors. That's a very interesting point you have raised. We are running out of time, so I will not attempt any more summaries. What I want to do is now to turn it over to Professor Adunbi. You see what you have caused. Sorry? Mosuru, you are here. Yeah, I was saying, where were you?
I'm with you from the beginning. I'm with you.
Okay, I was wondering because I didn't see you.
I lost my number, but later I joined.
Well, time has gone far, so you probably may just take. We have roughly 20 minutes left. Is it possible that you will give us an abridged version? I'm sorry to do this.
You said what?
I said, can you give us an abridged, a shorter version of your own presentation so that we can give the author time to respond? Is that okay?
Hello, sir. You said what? Let me hear you again.
I said that time has gone, and is it possible for you to give us a shorter version of your presentation so we can give Professor Adunbi time to respond?
Okay. How many minutes? In how many minutes?
If you can do 6 minutes, that would be nice.
Okay, I'll try.
Try, please. Thank you.
Okay, let me lower the video because I don't want the network to,
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to congratulate Professor Adunbi for this wonderful book. It is one book that you pick and you read from the beginning. You don't want to leave it. And that is why we are here to do the review, and so that the intending readers would appreciate what the effort Professor Adunbi has put into writing this book. The book interrogates the interconnectedness, of course, of two types of enclaves in contemporary Nigeria: artisanal refineries and free trade zones. Now, the uniqueness of this book, to me, is seen in the lucid and illuminating description of ways in which the environment interacts with the questions of sovereignty, belonging, and neoliberal ideas of the market economy. A part of this book discusses China and Chinese nationals and firms in the free trade zones of Nigeria, the Lekki free trade zones and Ogun Guangdong free trade zones, while the other part describes the operation of the various numerous artisanal refineries across the entire Niger Delta region of Nigeria. Adunbi argues that the new FTCs are disrupting traditional power structures, cultural practices, and nations of sovereignty. If we look at the chapter 3 of the book, in the chapter 3 of the book, it discusses the historical antecedents of how the communities in the special economic zones lost their sovereignty in both colonial and post-colonial period. The Chinese, for instance, operating at the FTCs, enjoy autonomy and dominance over Nigerians within the zones to the extent that the zones are conceptualized to be spaces not located in Nigeria. For instance, the zones have their own regulatory practices, including system of surveillance and policing. In fact, at the entrance of the zones, according to Adunbi, state apparatuses such as customs, immigration, and police offices, but the officials at these offices are never allowed into the zones. And then that reminds one of the historical events of the 19th century, when the Europeans came calling and they signed treaties of protection with African leaders. I mean, one begins to wonder, how could our leaders have ceded the sovereignty in the way to foreigners, with the activities of the Chinese firms in all these so-called free trade zones, if they could have their own policing system and our own security structures are being relegated to the background. And in addition to these, something that is also fascinating is that besides profit repatriation by the companies operating at the free trade zones, that is 100%, they also enjoy offshore banking, which provides platform that allows the operators in the zones to bypass banking regulations in addition to easy access to foreign exchange. And you see, I'm very much interested in that area. Professor, do we need to expatiate on that, this issue of easy access to foreign exchange? How? And then still talking about the free trade zones, he mentioned that the area has been badly affected by dispossession and destruction of ancestral heritage. Livelihood had been destroyed, lands taken over, ancestral shrines. And I was wondering, that was it a thing of promissory notes alone? In the book, there is a vivid description of how they met with the indigenes and then they were threatened. But of course, recently, we also saw a video circulating when the Dangote refinery was launched recently, and the governor of Lagos was talking to the community. It was more or less an abridged version of what really happened. So Adunbi has succeeded in bringing from the obscure to the fore what really transpired through his narratives. Now, if you look at the chapter 4, it's dedicated to the artisanal processes and structures of extraction, which reflect innovative and hybrid forms of knowledge, particularly in technology of ogogoro production, which has become useful in the production of crude oil by today's youth, especially in the creeks of the Niger Delta. It traces the origin of this ogogoro technology to the 1930s, when liquor was banned by the colonial authorities, and the knowledge of turning palm wine to ogogoro locally was imported from America. This is a very good aspect of the book too, that, unlike the belief that Nigerian youth are lazy, is coming from another perspective to say that, look, they are also innovative, and that given what is the enabling environment, they could also come out well to do things, learning from transfer of technology. But then I quickly move to the chapter 5 of the book, which is dedicated to the discussion of the oil infrastructure, technologies of extraction and production. I will summarize this chapter by saying that all what a layman needs to know about the oil theft and functionality of the artisanal refineries in the creeks of the Niger Delta in Nigeria are discussed from pages 140 to 150 of the book comprehensively. In fact, the author, like a detective, submits that in most cases, the insurgents who are hired by the state as surveillance contractors to police the pipelines are also those who make ownership claims to the point of oil theft. And that is quite very interesting, because even Asari Dokubo recently kind of confirmed that when he alluded in his recent this thing at the Aso Rock, that the soldiers were actually responsible for stealing Nigeria's oil. But of course, in connivance with those who have better knowledge of the environment. Now, I quickly round off by looking at the chapter 6, which discusses the aftermath of establishment of free trade zones and the activities of the artisanal refineries on the environment. The author describes it as the social death of the environment. Well, as much as I wish to present my review, time is not really on my side. But I'll quickly conclude by saying that, you know, the activities of the multinationals, of course, has brought untold hardship to the environment. And also in the case of the free trade zones, dredging of ocean, dispossession of lands, environmental pollution, and loss of sovereignty are negative impact of operating free trade zones in Nigeria. This book is recommended for researchers, policymakers, NGOs, state security, and development studies students. I want to congratulate Professor Adunbi. Quite unfortunate, I don't have enough time to do the proper, to really do my presentation. But I can assure you that I will work on it and get this published. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Monsuru. I'm sorry that technology played a role in your disappearance and also played a role in your reappearance. But I thank you for your understanding. I think you have made a lot of important points about the role of history, about the interrogation of sovereignty, and at some point you gave a nationalist reading of the impact of special economic zones as reflected in what was happening at Lekki and also in the Niger Delta. And what I live with is the fact that Nigerian youth are not lazy, and they are innovative and they are creative. At this point, I want to invite Professor Adunbi to respond to this rich diversity of views on the book, but everybody agrees that it is innovative and it is a great book. And I agree with them. Because of time, if you can limit yourself to 8 minutes, so that we will at least have somebody from our audience at the University of Lagos to have some input. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll spend less than 8 minutes. You've already done a lot by highlighting some of the many parts of this book. And as I was listening to all of you, I kept asking myself, did I actually write this book? It's you know, kind of nostalgia that every author feels. You know, when you are writing, you are just pouring out your mind and disaggregating your data. Then by the time you are done with writing, you just leave it, you know, you just send it out and it's gone. Then through the review process is when you now begin to pay attention to some of the little details that are in the book. And you'll be asking yourself, oh, did I say this or did I say that? And that was exactly what I felt when all of you were speaking. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So there are a lot of questions raised, which I may not have enough time to go into. You know, questions about gender, questions about sovereignty, questions about enclaving. But what I want to do is to just give you a few hints about how this project actually started. You know, it started like, you know, a China in Africa project. And when I started the project, I kept asking myself, you know, I hate to be part of a crowd. And I said, what can I do distinctively, you know, that will not make me part of this, everyone that is focusing on China in Africa, China in Africa. Said, okay, I am going to look at what my former interlocutors in the Niger Delta are doing now. So my first, you know, and at that point had already done like 2 summers of research at the Ogungonjon Free Trade Zone as well as the Lekki Free Trade Zone. So when I took that trip to the Niger Delta and I visited some of the places that I had done research previously for my first book, so I saw a lot of artisanal refineries in those sites. And when I looked at the images of the free trade zones in Lekki and Ogun, that I began to think that, look, there are similarities in the ways in which these zones are designed. And that was what led me to begin to think that, look, I can actually do a book about these two zones. Then the second thing is, I said, if I'm going to do this book, it is going to be a provocative book. And the reason why I said it's going to be a provocative book is because special economic zones are often seen as something that is regulated by the state. And other zones that are outside of these are sometimes, for political scientists, they will say non-state actors. Non-state actors engaging in practices that the state might frown at. So when I looked at that, I said, no, that is actually not what is going on. Everyone wants to be part of this neoliberal capitalism that is emerging in Nigeria, and that the artisanal refiners, particularly the former insurgents who are organizing these artisanal refineries, also want to participate in that. And that is what free market promotes. And so that was what led me to begin to think about the comparison that I described in these spaces. Then the other thing is that when I now went to the archives at Ibadan, I came across a lot of materials on Ogogoro, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s during the Great Depression, when the British administrators were looking for ways of raising taxes in order to get Britain out of the economic depression that they found themselves. So they looked into their colonies, and Nigeria was one of those colonies. But the response of Nigerians to that was also to begin to be innovative about how to circumvent the colonial authorities. And I was able to draw a parallel that, look, what happened during the colonial era when the youths emerged as those who tried to circumvent the colonial authorities are also what we are seeing in the Niger Delta, where those who are disenfranchised are also looking for opportunities to circumvent what the state put in place. And that was what led me to the chapter on Ogogoro and the innovativeness of the youths. And again, when I was doing the research, I was in the Delta, and I encountered, as I described in the book, I encountered some USAID contractors. And in my conversation with them, they described Niger Delta youths as very lazy. And I disagree with that. I said, look, I've been doing research in this region for several years. These youths are very innovative. They are not lazy. It is just because the state screws them up. That is why they find themselves in a position that they find themselves. But that that even when the state tries to screw them, they look for other ways of making ends meet. And that is the innovativeness that I see in the artisanal refineries. Then when going through the literature, I saw that a lot of scholars oftentimes refer to what is going on in the Delta as survival strategies. And I said, look, if we reduce it to survival strategies, we will be taking a lot of agencies of these youths away from them. It is not just mere survival strategies. It is about designing a system that is integrated into the economy of the state. And the final point I'll make, then I'll close so that the audience can ask their question, is the notion of informality. And I also take exception to that look, many of these youths, if we describe them as being in the informal sector, which is how we describe many businesses in Nigeria, that is actually not the case, that everyone participates in a neoliberal economy. So the distinction between formal and informal sector sometimes is a way of just relegating the kind of innovativeness and inclusiveness that a lot of the communities and youths that are into businesses in Nigeria that they bring into the table. So rather than saying that these are informal businesses, I am saying that they are neoliberal economic businesses that are participating in a global capitalist system that is designed, that Nigeria is modeling itself after. But that the consequences of all of this is what I call the social death of the environment. That while many of these youths are innovative, but at the end of the day, whether it is the free trade zone in Lekki or in Ogun, or the artisanal refineries, the consequences are the same. The environment and the people who live in them are condemned to a form of social death. And now everyone is celebrating Dangote, that Nigeria is going to be self-sufficient in refined oil. But no one is talking about the consequences of locating a refinery in an urban center. And that is a social death that is going to happen very soon. By the time the refinery starts operation, the whole of that Lekki area is going to be suffering from a lot of pollution. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. I think you deserve a round of applause. Now we don't have much time. We just have barely 2 minutes. I don't know how much extension the organizers can give us, but I want to invite at least somebody from the audience to ask a question. Is anybody there with you?
Yeah, there are a lot of people here. I don't know where the camera is focusing on me.
Yeah, we also did not have the opportunity to see. Okay, so who wants to say something or ask a question? There is still
Professor
time.
Chono is here and he wants to.
Please go ahead.
Mine is not really a question. I just want to say that one of the reasons that I love this book so much is that for us historians, we like chronology. And this book has chronology. We often accuse anthropologists of freezing time. And the reason we like chronology is that, we like change. We like to see change unfold over time. And there's change in this book, and there's chronology. So I love this book so much, and it tells a story as well. We like stories. But one of for me, the most important intervention of this work is in dissolving, I think you alluded to it shortly a while ago, dissolving this, what I consider a contrived dichotomy between the formal sector and the informal sector. And you show, it's not just in terms of the parallel that you see between the Lekki and the Ogun zone on the one hand, and the artisanal refineries. The parallels are there, but it's also in certain chapters of the book, you discuss how even in the artisanal refiners, those ex-militants, the state relies on them in certain, so they meet and interact. So there's a point of interaction. There's a space where the two supposedly distinct sectors meet and interact and rely on one another. There's a symbiotic relationship between those two zones. So for me, that's a very powerful and innovative argument. And it can apply even beyond this context. You can apply it in multiple other contexts. So I'd like to thank you for that enlightening perspective.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Professor Adunbi, for the book. Professor Adunbi's work is the work I've used several times, in rethinking my own research about power, about infrastructure. So, and sir, the question I just wanted to ask, I know in your book, and just like some of the articles that preceded the publication of the book, you sort of framed the activities that you saw in the Niger Delta as innovation. And you also alluded to that just going away from the popular conception of activities like these as survival strategies. And I was wondering, is it possible to do both at the same time? Is it possible to conceptualize them at this? Because I struggle with some of these terminologies too, as somebody who is undertaking training in the Department of Anthropology, talking about survival strategies. And I was curious. I see the activities of these artisanals, if that's the correct word, as a way to sort of contest state hegemony and state monopoly over oil resources, and to sort of contest the marginalization of their community, and in so doing to sort of put food on their own table and to get resources that were not made available to them. So can we say in a way they are innovating to sort of survive some of the obstacles that the state throws at them, or you are just focusing basically on these activities as innovation and not as survival strategies? Thank you.
Let's take the last one, and then you can respond.
Thank you very much. I think that we are out of time, but since we are still on, just permit me, just in case the feed cuts off, to thank Professor Adunbi for an amazing book and for our 5 distinguished discussants for bringing so much depth into the discussion of the book. At this point, I want to invite a lady from the audience. In the interest of gender balance, one of the ladies in the audience should please ask the next question.
Okay.
I just came in actually, but from the little heard, I think can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think the conversation is interesting because I just heard Professor Trump talking about the chronological approach of the book, as well as the fact that the book did talk about environmental pollution. Like I said, I haven't read the book and I just came in, and I think for me that's fascinating, and that's what inspired me to read the book.
Thank you. Is there any who can take only one more person? One more person, please.
Okay,
Thank
sir. Thanks, sir. I'll be very brief. I've not read the book, to be honest.
What's your name?
Yeah, my name is Philip Olayoko.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to make from discussions that have been held on the book, I just want to just ask the author, perhaps if you could shed more light on the concept of the term of governance when it comes to these different zones. And I'm looking at the free trade zone from the larger perspective of the African continental free trade zone that has been proposed. And if you're saying that there is a bit of Chinese dominance, within the Nigerian context at the moment, how do we maximize what this initiative is supposed, to project when it comes to productivity and expansion of the economy? The second aspect is also that perhaps you're arguing that these are not informal sectors. What is the role of the government? How can governance come to, help in sustaining these initiatives so that they are integrated, within the broader framework of the nation's economy? Yeah, those are just my two.
Thank you. Professor Adunbi, you have the floor, and then I will invite the discussants, if we are still on, to say their last words. I will just say thank you at the end, and that's it. So please.
All right. Thank you very much. The first question I'll respond to about the survival strategies. Every human tries to survive, and they develop survival strategies too. So when you're looking for a job, that is a survival strategy. So when you get the job and you're trying to survive, you're trying to make ends meet, that is a survival strategy. So, but I don't want to reduce the innovativeness of these youths to just mere survival strategies, because if you look at the ways in which they develop this technology, from ogogoro to refining oil, that is not just mere survival strategy, that is innovation. And we need to commend them for that. So that is what I'm driving at in this book. Then on the informal sector, although I didn't go into some of these details in the book, which of course, as you know, when you are writing a book, there are a lot of things that get cut out of it. So my worry is that when we think about the Western world, for example, you hardly see the notion of informal sector used to refer to even small businesses, kiosks, and they are known as small business owners. So why should we see our own small business owners as being in the informal sector? And bear in mind that all of these so-called informal sectors are regulated by the state. They are registered by the state. You cannot operate a business in Lagos, for example, without registering as a business. So that indicates that they are not informal. They are formal because they are registered and they pay taxes to local government and to the state. So in that sense, we need to move away from seeing all of these sectors as informal sector, because everyone wants to participate in this neoliberal economic system that is driven by profit. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I will invite the discussants to give us 1 minute each of their closing remarks in reverse order. So Monsuru will have 1 minute to say something. That will be his closing remark, and that will be followed by Obasesam, Vivian, David, and Abosed. 1 minute each.
Thank you very much, Prof. I want to thank every one of us that have participated in this panel. I want to thank the author, Professor. Job well done. This book is very interesting, and it's one book that if you pick it, you want to read it from the beginning to the end. And I want to thank LSA for giving us the opportunity to engage this new book on the stable of scholars. And I want to thank every one of us that have participated. And we look forward to more of this kind of book from each and every one of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsuru. Obasisa.
Okay. Well, I want to once again thank Professor Adunbi for this intellectually provocative book. For me, I think he has caused more trouble. He has invited an intellectual conversation, for us to rethink the ongoing transformations in the political economy of development and underdevelopment in the Niger Delta and in Nigeria in general, and the role that artisanal refining plays in these transformations. So we now have to deepen our theoretical lenses to reconceptualize these transformations and make meanings out of them, especially as they intersect with the environment. Again, this is a big invitation to re-theorize, reconceptualize what we, a terrain that is already familiar and try to make new meanings out of it. So I think most of us will be picking the book again in the near future, reading it in depth and making more creative responses. So I want to thank you, Professor Adu, for writing such a powerful book, and thank you, Professor Obi, for moderating this session.
Thank you very much. Vivian, can you keep it short? The organizers are already telling me that we have to stop.
Okay.
But I want everybody to have their say. Please.
Thank you.
Very brief.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I thought this was really informative. I actually had skipped over because of time some comments on the whole informal intervention that the book was making. So I'm glad the discussion got to that, and it really just tries to situate these Chinese investments in this longer context of Nigerian history, how they both replicate, reproduce, and create new kinds of surveillance and enclaving, but that it's also not completely unique. And so making those creative linkages across space and time is what I really appreciated. And thank you so much, and congratulations on the book again.
Thank you very much. David.
So thanks all the responses for this provocative discussion, and especially thanks to you, Siri, for managing this discussion, and to Omolade for writing this great provocative book. And Omolade, I hope to see you there in a couple of hours. I'll try to be there at the UNILAC. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Bosse, you have 1 minute, please.
I also want to thank Professor Adunbi for this very fascinating book, because it makes a lot of critical issues. It enriched knowledge, not just in cultural anthropology, in various fields, like Professor Monsura said. So I also want to thank Professor Obi for bringing out some critical issues. And I think I'm more interested because it relates to some of my current research. So I think we have learned a lot from the work, and they are also bring forth some other issues we can also examine, investigate, probe further on these various issues that have been discussed in the work. So I think I thank you. I thank everyone. Thank you. And I thank my colleagues too, who have discussed on all this. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bosse. Congratulations to Professor Adubi for a great book. Thank you to LSA for giving us an extension of time and putting together this brilliant conference and panel. And from me, it's goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.